Hello everyone, TLSG here, back again with another daily Marvel Snap video. Today we have the hot location, Death's Domain. For those that may not know, hot locations occur in 60% of games on the 24 hours that it's active. And so depending on the location, it is usually worthwhile to build your deck, or at least tech it very heavily towards this location. And so this week we have Death's Domain. In Death's Domain, whenever you play a card here, it's going to be destroyed. And so while this location is very impactful, there are a lot of ways to kind of tech your deck around and build different things. There's going to be a lot of different archetypes that perform well today, and you're not going to be corralled into one particular deck. And so starting up with Pool 1. In Pool 1, you don't have a lot of resources. You need to have a couple of different ways to push power into Death's Domain if you want to stand a chance at competing for it. And in this list, you can do that by either using your Nightcrawler to move him over into that lane. You can use Mr. Sinister. That will destroy the original copy of Mr. Sinister, but his clone, so On Reveals, will trigger in Death's Domain before the original card gets destroyed. And so his clone will remain in place. Or you could lean into the White Tiger Odin On Reveal to re-trigger White Tiger to push a Tiger token into that lane. If you push a 7-power Tiger token, that's a lot of power into a lane that's difficult to play in. A lot of times that alone can win you that location. And so the idea is to kind of spread your power out across the board towards the end of the game once you know what resources you have or what your in-game strategy is going to be, whether it be throwing Nightcrawler and then buffing it up with Ironheart, whether it be doing a Mr. Sinister, buffing it up with Ironheart. And actually, as I'm talking through this one, I honestly think we could take out Korg and we could add in Nova. So with this location, we can throw in Nova. Nova is going to be a free and easy drop that's going to buff the rest of your board. So you just throw it into Death's Domain on either the last turn or nearing the last turn. That way you can buff up all of the rest of the cards that you have on the board. And so I think that's going to be a pretty reliable way to trigger some additional power onto the board. And I think it'll serve a little bit better purpose than your Korg with the hot location. And then we have Enchantress to deal with any kind of strong ongoing effects. We have Jessica Jones, which is just a really strong 4-drop card, into our 5-cost cards with White Tiger Gamora to rebuff them with Odin. And then next up we have a Pool 2 on reveal. So within Pool 2, you still don't have a lot of great resources to push power into that lane, but you do have a few more at your disposal than in Pool 1. And so you're going to have Jubilee. Jubilee is going to trigger her on reveal before she gets destroyed, and so you're going to be able to pull a card from your deck to push power into Death's Domain. This is going to be able to potentially pull your Gamora, your Infinite, your Chavez, your Jessica Jones. It can pull some of those really powerful resources onto the board for you. You also have Storm in Pool 2 that you're going to be able to use to potentially change that location. You can use Storm on 3 if the opponent hasn't played anything into that location. You can then follow that up with a Jessica Jones on 4, and it's going to be very hard for them to compete with you for the location. And so the idea of this one is very similar to our Pool 1 build, only it uses Sunspot, which is inherently risky with Killmongers running around, but it also uses Infinite, which you can potentially pull with Jubilee. You can skip into dropping it on turn 6 if you have a Sunspot that you feel is safe and not going to get destroyed. You have Shang-Chi to destroy any large cards that you run up against, and then you have your traditional White Tiger, Gamora, Odin, that finisher play as well. And then in Pool 3, we have access to several different resources that can make this location work in our favor. So the first one is a pretty simple, pretty consistent deck that is going to perform well outside of this location as well, but this one is a Spectrum Destroyer hybrid. And so you're going to be able to throw things like your Colossus, your Professor X into that location. If you get outplayed, if you get outpowered, you can always buff that location up or those ongoing cards in that location with your Spectrum towards the end of the game. We have our Destroyer as that secondary play path. If we have armor to protect one of the lanes, or if we have Cosmo to drop our Destroyer in, that's going to allow us to push a lot of power onto the board. And it's going to be hard for the opponent to react to whatever path we end up playing, whether it be the Spectrum or the Destroyer. And so next up in Pool 3, we have a Death Wave style deck. Only with this one, I took out one of our destruction tools, because with Death's Domain, we're not going to need to reliably destroy Deadpool as often on the board. We're going to be able to just throw him into Death's Domain and watch him get destroyed over and over and over again. And so we can throw Deadpool onto the board. I took out Deathlock and we added in BAEro. So this is going to be a mixture between a Death Wave and BAEro, which we all know is a very consistent deck. And so you're going to be able to have several play paths on that final turn. If you got your Deadpool early and you buffed him up quite large, then you could go with a Deadpool and a Taskmaster on the final turn. You could potentially go with a Deadpool and an Arrow. You could go with a Deadpool and a Death, an Arrow and a Death. You just have a lot more flexibility with this list and with this location, giving you free deaths for your Deadpool. And then next up, we have one that I have featured a couple of times now, but I just really enjoy it. It's one of the more unique builds I've ever played, and it's the only one I've found that reasonably wants to use Yellow Jacket and Hawkeye. And so with this list, the idea is to either get an early advantage in an Adam Warlock lane to draw into the rest of your resources. You can use Yellow Jacket as a way to get 1 extra power with the Destroyer drop at the end of the game. You can use your Swarms as free cards to buff up after or alongside your Destroyer once you drop it on that final turn. But the idea is that you want to reliably lock down a lane with Professor X, and then have some cheap resources to go alongside your Destroyer to make it harder for the opponent to outpace you. And with Death's Domain, you're going to want to lock down a lane relatively early, and so most of the time we want to play either our Hawkeye, Sunspot, or Adam Warlock into an undiscovered location. And so if that turns out to be Death's Domain, perfect. If not, we're looking to either ramp up into an early Professor X or do a Spider-Man into a Professor X so that we can lock down a lane consistently. And if we drop Professor X and then we also drop our Swarms behind the Professor X, we can actually sneak those into the lane. They're not going to get destroyed because Professor X will reveal, he will stop any cards from being destroyed or added to the lane after the fact. But since the Swarms were played ahead of time, they will be able to flip and their power will be able to retain in that location. And that's why I think this version is going to be pretty good today, because you're going to be able to do a couple of cheeky things like that to push some additional power alongside your Professor X to more consistently lock down the Death's Domain location or even one of the other locations. And if you watched my top 5 decks for last week's location, this one's going to be very similar to the one we ran for Warrior Falls, and it's going to be an Electro ramp deck. The idea is to ramp up early, either lock down a lane with Professor X, drop a Hobgoblin in a lane, drop an early leader to copy whatever the opponent plays. We have a Dr. Doom that can go wide into Death's Domain. We have Odin that can re-trigger the Dr. Doom if we played it early, or if we ramped up and did leader early, we can always use an Odin to re-trigger our leader to copy what they played on 2 turns rather than 1. And a lot of times that second leader trigger is not one that the opponent is going to anticipate. And so there's a lot of flexibility with this list. Electro ramp decks are just really inherently strong if you can draw into your Electro. If not, you have a couple of ideal play paths with your Daredevil into a turn 5, either Hobgoblin or Professor X, but it just becomes a little bit less impactful if you don't have the Electro ramp portion. And then next up, we have a list from one of the top players from the game. A lot of times they reach well over infinite rank, several hundred ranks, and they kind of coined a Wide Wong deck list. And so what it does and what it does well is spread your power across the board. And so whether that be a Wong into a White Tiger, which will send 2 Tiger tokens across the board, into a Dr. Doom, or into an Odin, Odin re-triggering White Tiger in a Wong lane is going to trigger it 4 more times, in addition to the 2 that it triggered the first time it was dropped. And so with Wong and Odin, the interaction is really strong. You can even preemptively drop an Ironheart if you know you're going to go with the Wong into that lane. Now this one does start falling short if you run into a lot of Cosmo plays, but otherwise it is very strong, and it's going to be able to consistently push a high amount of power into Death's Domain without much issue. But those are my top 5 deck recommendations to try out for the hot location today. Let me know what decks you're running. Let me know if you ran one of these and if it worked well. If it didn't work, let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, this has been TLSG. Later, guys.